An 11-year-old girl genius lawyer faced the court alone, but the judge's response was cruel. Enjoy the story. The sound of rain tapping against the tall windows was the only softness in a courtroom thick with tension and disbelief. Outside, Chicago's skyline disappeared behind sheets of gray water, casting the wood-paneled room in a somber light. At the bench sat Judge Walter Harrison, a man whose stern face had been carved by 30 years of passing judgment. His black robe hung, perfectly pressed around his tall frame, and when he cleared his throat, the sound ricocheted off the walls like a warning. He was known for his coldness, his raised voice, and his brutal sarcasm toward anyone who fell below his expectations. The courthouse staff called him the Hammer behind closed doors, and attorneys prepared for his courtroom like soldiers for battle. At the far end of the room, seated alone and out of place among the rows of men in sharp suits and polished shoes, was a small girl, barely 11 years old. Her clothes were too large, hand-me-downs worn thin, and her backpack had a broken zipper, clumsily stitched with blue thread. Her shoes, damp from the rain outside, squeaked faintly every time she shifted nervously in her seat. Freckles dotted her pale face, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She clutched a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to her mother, her knuckles white with tension. "Call for the plaintiff's representation," Judge Harrison barked, tapping his gavel with the force of someone perpetually impatient. A moment of hushed confusion passed through the courtroom. Then the little girl rose. She stood on trembling legs, took a deep breath, and with all the strength her small frame could summon, she said, "Your Honor, I am the legal representative for Mr. Ruiz." A wave of murmurs, stifled laughter, and disbelief rippled through the courtroom. A child, representing someone in a legal battle over inheritance. Even the court clerk looked confused, casting a glance toward the judge, who narrowed his eyes and leaned forward with a scoff. "This is not a school play, young lady. Where is your guardian? Who allowed this nonsense?" His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "My name is Nancy Miller," she replied softly, "and I passed the bar at 10. I have my legal certification here. Please, just look at it." The judge let out a sound halfway between a sigh and a growl. He waved the bailiff to retrieve the document. With theatrical slowness, Judge Harrison flipped through the pages, his eyebrows climbing higher with each turn. Then his expression shifted. The papers were real. Still, he snapped, "Even if this is technically legal, you're just a little... Girl, you shouldn't be in here playing pretend while real people's futures are at stake." Nancy flinched but didn't back down. She simply said, "I'm not here to play. I'm here to defend my client. He has no one else. I promised him I'd fight." Some in the courtroom chuckled again, amused by her seriousness. But there was one person who didn't laugh. Mr. Ruiz, the elderly man seated nearby with calloused hands and eyes full of hope. He watched Nancy as one watches a tiny candle in a storm, with fragile faith. The judge gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. Let's waste our time then. You may proceed." Nancy opened her folder with trembling fingers. Her voice, low at first but steadying with each word. She explained the misinterpretation of a will, how her client, a quiet, humble janitor at the local hospital, had been unfairly excluded from an inheritance he was promised. She showed documents, quoted legal codes with stunning precision, and called upon signed testimonies that proved her point. Yet throughout her presentation she was mocked. The opposing lawyer, Richard Thornton, a man older than her grandfather with silver hair and a Harvard pin on his lapel, smirked openly, interrupting her with demeaning questions. "Tell me, miss, did you find your legal advice in a coloring book?" Thornton asked, not bothering to hide his contempt. But Nancy never answered with venom, only clarity. "I found it in Black's Law Dictionary, section 1034, paragraph C, Mr. Thornton, the same place you should have looked before filing your motion to dismiss." The courtroom hushed momentarily before Thornton's face darkened. Judge Harrison's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to surprise. As the day proceeded, Nancy's composure began to crack under the constant pressure. Her voice wavered when Thornton produced a document she hadn't seen before, a supposed amendment to the will that further excluded Mr. Ruiz. The elderly man's shoulders slumped, and Nancy felt the weight of his despair added to her own burden. "Your Honor," she began, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Your Honor, I request a 15-minute recess to review this new evidence." Judge Harrison checked his watch with exaggerated impatience. "You have 10 minutes, Miss Miller. The court doesn't run on elementary school schedules." As Nancy hurried from the courtroom, the weight of impossibility pressed down on her small shoulders. In the hallway, she slumped against the wall, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like the anxiety in her chest. How could she, a child genius or not, stand against the machinery of a system that viewed her as nothing more than an amusing distraction? Would David truly defeat Goliath this time? Or was she fooling herself, and worse, giving false hope to kind Mr. Ruiz, who had so little left to hold on to? The rain continued to beat against the windows, matching the rhythm of Nancy's racing heart, as she frantically thumbed through law books twice her weight, searching for a path forward in a world built for giants, not little girls with oversized dreams. The courthouse clock ticked mercilessly as Nancy pored over the new amendment, her mind racing. Something wasn't right. The signatures looked different than the original will. As she squinted at the document under the harsh hallway light, an elderly clerk passing by paused, peering over her shoulder. "Having trouble, young lady?" he asked, his voice kind. "The signatures don't match, but I can't prove it fast enough," Nancy whispered, desperation edging into her voice. The clerk adjusted his glasses. "You know, we have a document verification specialist on staff. Sarah in room 304 has been examining. Handwriting for 30 years. Nancy's eyes widened. "Can I speak with her now? I only have 7 minutes left." "Follow me," the clerk said, already walking briskly down the corridor. Sarah, a woman with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses, perched on her nose, barely looked up from her desk when they entered. But when the clerk explained the situation, she held out her hand for the documents. She murmured, examining the signatures under a magnifying glass. "Definitely inconsistent pressure points. The T crosses are completely different styles." She scribbled a quick note, signed it, and handed it to Nancy. "Good luck, counselor." With 2 minutes to spare, Nancy raced back to the courtroom, her squeaky shoes announcing her return. As she took her place at the table, she caught Mr. Ruiz's eye. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of faith that somehow made her stand taller. "Your Honor," Nancy began, her voice clearer now, "I would like to question the authenticity of this amendment. I have a preliminary analysis from the court's document specialist indicating inconsistencies in the signature. I move to have it officially examined." Thornton's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "I'll allow it," Judge Harrison interrupted, surprising everyone, including himself. "Document will be examined by the court specialist. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." As the courtroom began to empty, Nancy heard Thornton hissing into his phone. "She's just a kid, for God's sake. How hard can it be to bury her argument?" Nancy's stomach knotted. Tomorrow would be even harder. And somewhere in this building, Thornton was already planning how to crush her case. And, with it, Mr. Ruiz's last hope. That evening, Nancy sat at her small desk in the apartment she shared with her grandmother, Edith. Their home was modest, a 2-bedroom walk-up in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Books were stacked everywhere, on shelves, tables, chairs, and in precarious towers on the floor. Law volumes mixed with children's literature, creating a strange library that told the story of Nancy's life. "I should eat something, dear," Edith said, placing a sandwich beside Nancy's elbow. Her grandmother's hands were gnarled from arthritis, but they still moved with purpose and love. "I can't, Grandma. I have to prepare for tomorrow." Nancy didn't look up from the legal pad where she was frantically writing notes. Edith sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell me what happened today." Nancy's pen stopped moving. "They laughed at me, Grandma. The judge called it a circus." Her voice was small, matching her frame. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just a joke." Edith took Nancy's hand, her own wrinkled one enveloping her granddaughter's small fingers. "Nancy Miller, you listen to me. Your mother didn't raise a quitter, and neither did I. You're not just book smart, you have something that can't be taught, heart. But the opposing lawyer is so experienced, and the judge hates me and nothing Edith interrupted. Your client needs you, that's all that matters. Nancy nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She looked at the framed photograph on her desk, a smiling woman with Nancy's same auburn hair and determined eyes. Her mother, Elizabeth, had been a paralegal who dreamed of becoming a lawyer but never got the chance. Cancer had taken her just 14 months ago. Mom would know what to do, Nancy whispered. She would tell you to trust yourself. Edith replied, and to eat your sandwich before it gets stale. With a small smile, Nancy took a bite. Then she turned back to her notes, a new determination in her eyes. Tomorrow would be different. It had to be. Morning arrived with grudging sunshine after the previous day's downpour. Nancy walked up the courthouse steps beside Mr. Ruiz, who moved slowly with his cane. He had been a janitor at the hospital where Elizabeth Miller had received treatment. During those painful months, he had often stayed late to mop her room, bringing extra blankets and sometimes sneaking in home-cooked meals that were more appetizing than hospital food. When Elizabeth passed, he continued checking on Nancy and Edith, becoming a fixture in their diminished family. You don't have to do this for me, pequeña abogada, Mr. Ruiz said quietly as they approached the imposing doors. Little Lawyer, his nickname for her since she started studying her mother's law books. Yes, I do, Nancy replied, adjusting her too large blazer. You were there for us, now I'm here for you. Inside the courtroom, Thornton was already seated, looking smugly confident. But Nancy noticed something different today. Witnesses. 3 elderly people sat in the gallery, watching her with curious eyes. Judge Harrison called the court to order, his gavel crack echoing through the room. I understand the document examiner has completed her analysis. Sarah approached the bench and handed over her report. Your Honor, the signature on the amendment does not match the testator's known signatures. In my professional opinion, it appears to be forged. Thornton leapt to his feet. This is outrageous. I demand a second opinion. You'll have your chance, Counselor, Judge Harrison said coldly. He turned to Nancy. Miss Miller, proceed with your case. Nancy stood, her heart hammering but her voice steady. I'd like to call Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins to the stand. One of the elderly women in the gallery rose and made her way forward. After being sworn in, she settled into the witness chair, her eyes kind as they met Nancy's. Mrs. Jenkins, what was your relationship to Mr. James Whittaker, the deceased? I was his home nurse for the last 5 years of his life, she answered clearly. And during that time, did Mr. Whittaker ever discuss his will with you? Objection, Thornton barked. Hearsay. Your Honor, Nancy countered. Under Illinois Evidence Code Section 65.3, statements regarding the testator's intent are admissible in will disputes as an exception to hearsay. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Overruled. The witness, may answer. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. Yes, many times. Mr. Whittaker was very clear about who he wanted to inherit his estate. He wanted to leave his house and savings to Carlos Ruiz, who had been his friend for over 40 years. Did he ever mention changing his mind? Never. In fact, the day before he passed, he asked me to make sure Carlos would be taken care of. He said, that house belongs to Carlos, make sure he gets it. As Mrs. Jenkins continued her testimony, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. The mockery faded as the truth emerged. Mr. Whittaker had indeed intended for his friend Carlos to inherit his modest estate. The family members contesting the will were distant cousins who had never once visited during his illness. By lunchtime, Nancy had presented 3 witnesses, including Mr. Whittaker's doctor and his neighbor of 20 years. Each testimony strengthened Mr. Ruiz's claim, and Nancy's confidence grew with each question she asked. But when court resumed, after lunch, Thornton came armed with a new strategy. Instead of attacking the evidence, he attacked Nancy herself. Your Honor, regardless of the testimony we've heard, I move to dismiss this case on the grounds that Miss Miller is not qualified to represent Mr. Ruiz. Child prodigy or not, she lacks the experience and emotional maturity to handle a case of this nature. Judge Harrison looked at Nancy. Miss Miller, do you have a response to this motion? Nancy felt every eye in the courtroom on her. Her legs trembled beneath her too large skirt, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Your Honor, experience comes in many forms. I may not have tried cases for decades like Mr. Thornton, but I understand what matters here. A promise between friends, the last wishes of a dying man, and the meaning of true family." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "The law doesn't require decades of experience to recognize justice. It requires the ability to see the truth and the courage to fight for it." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison's expression remained unreadable as he studied the small figure before him. "Motion denied," he said finally. "This court will hear the remainder of the case." Thornton's face reddened. "Your Honor." "That's my ruling, Counselor." Judge Harrison cut him off sharply. "Continue with your cross-examination." As Thornton rose to question Nancy's last witness, his eyes promised retribution. This battle was far from over, and Nancy knew the hardest fight was yet to come. Would her knowledge of the law be enough against Thornton's years of courtroom manipulation? Would Judge Harrison truly give her a fair chance, or was he simply prolonging the inevitable dismissal of her case? As the afternoon stretched on, Nancy clung to her mother's words, written in the margin of a law book. "Justice isn't about winning. It's about standing up when no one else will." The day ended with neither side clearly victorious. As Nancy packed her briefcase, she noticed Judge Harrison watching her, his expression thoughtful. For the first time, he looked at her not as an amusing oddity, but as an attorney who had managed to hold her ground. What would tomorrow bring in this unlikely legal battle? Only time would tell if David truly had a chance against Goliath. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated solely because of their age or appearance? Share your experience in the comments below. The courtroom the next morning buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread about the child lawyer, and now the gallery was filled with spectators, and even a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. Nancy tried to ignore the whispers and stares as she organized her notes at the plaintiff's table. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Harrison entered. The day began with Thornton calling his own witnesses, financial advisors, and a handwriting expert who questioned the court examiner's findings. Each testimony was designed to paint Mr. Ruiz as an opportunist, trying to claim money that wasn't rightfully his. During cross-examination, Nancy's small size belied her sharp mind. When Thornton's handwriting expert claimed the signature could be authentic, Nancy methodically dismantled his credibility. "Dr. Peterson, you stated you've examined over 2,000 documents in your career, correct?" "Yes, that's right," he replied with practiced confidence. "And how many of those examinations have been accepted as evidence in court?" He hesitated. "I don't keep exact records." Nancy pulled out a folder. "According to the Cook County Court records, your testimony has been deemed inadmissible in 11 cases over the past 5 years for, quote, methodology inconsistent with accepted standards. Is that accurate?" The gallery murmured as the expert squirmed. Judge Harrison leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Furthermore," Nancy continued, "you were paid $5,000 by the defendants for your testimony today. Isn't that an unusually high fee for document analysis?" By the time she finished, the expert's testimony lay in tatters. Even Judge Harrison seemed impressed, though he quickly hid it behind his usual stern demeanor. During the lunch recess, Nancy overheard Thornton on his phone in the hallway. "Plan B, bring him in now." There was something in his tone that sent a chill through her. When court resumed, Thornton called a surprise witness, Frank Miller, Nancy's estranged father. Nancy froze as a man she barely recognized walked to the stand. He had left when she was 3, disappearing from their lives completely. Now here he was, clean-shaven and wearing a suit that looked new. "Mr. Miller," Thornton began smoothly, "as the father of Nancy Miller, do you believe she is emotionally equipped to handle a case of this nature?" Frank Miller glanced at his daughter, then back at Thornton. "No. Nancy has always been different. Too smart for her own good. My ex-wife encouraged her obsessions, but a child has no business in a courtroom. And do you believe her involvement in this case is healthy for her development?" "Absolutely not. She should be in school, playing with friends. Normal kid. Stuff." Nancy felt the room spinning. The betrayal cut deep, not just because it came from her father, but because he was using her mother's memory against her. "Objection, Your Honor," she managed to say, her voice thin. "This testimony is irrelevant to the case at hand and prejudicial." Judge Harrison studied her pale face. "I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Thornton, the psychological development of counsel is not at issue here. Move on or dismiss this witness." Thornton's strategy had backfired, but the damage was done. Nancy felt exposed, vulnerable. When she stood to cross-examine her father, her hands trembled visibly. "Mr. Miller," she began, the word father. Impossible to say. "When was the last time you saw me before today?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. "It's been a while." 8 years, 2 months, and 14 days, Nancy corrected. "You left on my 3rd birthday. You've never called, never written, never sent so much as a birthday card." "Nancy," he began. "Miss Miller, in this courtroom." She corrected him, her voice gaining strength. "Just one more question. How much did Mr. Thornton pay you to appear today?" Frank's eyes widened. Thornton jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is outrageous!" But the damage was already visible on Frank's face. The gallery erupted in whispers. "No further questions," Nancy said quietly, returning to her seat. As Frank Miller stepped down, he paused by Nancy's table. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but she kept her eyes on her notes, refusing to acknowledge him. The afternoon dragged on with technical arguments and procedural motions, but everyone could sense the case approaching its conclusion. Tomorrow would bring final arguments and, hopefully, a verdict. That evening, as Nancy and Mr. Ruiz left the courthouse, a reporter approached them. "Miss Miller, how does it feel to be the youngest attorney in Illinois history? Do you think you'll win?" Before Nancy could answer, Mr. Ruiz stepped forward. "She is not just young. She is brilliant and brave. She fights for justice when others see only impossible odds." His simple faith in her brought tears to Nancy's eyes. Win or lose, she had already given Mr. Ruiz something precious, the knowledge that someone believed his story worth fighting for. As they descended the courthouse steps, Nancy spotted Frank Miller waiting by a taxi. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. He raised his hand in a hesitant wave, but Nancy turned away. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt with a gesture. Tomorrow would decide everything, and Nancy Miller, all 11 years of her, was ready for the fight of her young life. Could justice truly wear the face of a child? The city of Chicago was about to find out. The final day of trial dawned, bright and clear, the courthouse steps crowded with curious onlookers and reporters. The story of the child lawyer had captured the public's imagination, and everyone wanted to see how it would end. Inside, Nancy sat at her table, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her small shoulders. Mr. Ruiz patted her hand gently. "Whatever happens, pequeña abogada, you have made an old man proud." Judge Harrison called the court to order for closing arguments. Thornton went first, his presentation polished and confident. He spoke of legal precedents and technicalities, dismissing the testimony of Mr. Whitaker's caretakers as sentimental nonsense that had no place in probate law. "Your Honor," he concluded, "this court must not allow emotion to cloud judgment. The amended will, regardless of questions about its signature, follows proper legal form. The plaintiff's case, presented by a, let's be honest, novelty attorney, relies too heavily on hearsay and sentiment. The law demands we respect the document as written." When Nancy's turn came, she approached the bench slowly. The courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters stopped scribbling, pens poised above notepads. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft but clear, "this case isn't about legal precedents or technicalities. It's about a promise. Mr. Whitaker promised his home to the person who had been true family to him, not related by blood but by loyalty and love." She gestured to Mr. Ruiz. When Mr. Whitaker was sick, it wasn't his cousins from Arizona who sat by his bed. It was Mr. Ruiz. When he needed groceries, it was Mr. Ruiz who brought them. When he was scared in the middle of the night, it was Mr. Ruiz's number he called. Nancy's voice grew stronger. "The law exists to protect what matters. And what mattered to Mr. Whitaker was that his friend, his real family, would have a home after he was gone. She picked up the disputed amendment. This piece of paper with its questionable signature doesn't represent justice. It represents an attempt to steal what rightfully belongs to a good man who asked for nothing in life except the chance to keep a promise to his friend. Nancy turned to face the gallery. "I may be young, Your Honor. I may not have decades of experience. But I know what's right, and I believe this court does too." With that, she returned to her seat. The courtroom remained silent for several heartbeats before Judge Harrison spoke. "This court will recess to consider a verdict. We will reconvene at 3 o'clock. The hours of waiting were torture. Nancy and Mr. Ruiz sat on a bench in the corridor, barely speaking. Edith arrived with sandwiches that neither of them could eat. The reporters kept a respectful distance, sensing the gravity of the moment. At precisely 3 o'clock, they filed back into the courtroom. Judge Harrison's face revealed nothing as he took his seat. "In the matter of Ruiz versus Whitaker Estate, this court has reached a decision." Nancy held her breath. Mr. Ruiz's hand found hers and squeezed gently. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, including the testimony of those closest to the deceased and the expert analysis of the disputed document, this court rules in favor of the plaintiff. The property at 1437 Maple Street shall be transferred to Mr. Carlos Ruiz, as per the original authenticated will. A collective gasp, then murmurs spread through the courtroom. Mr. Ruiz's eyes filled with tears, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, his voice softening slightly, "I have something to say to counsel." He looked directly at Nancy, his stern face showing a hint of something new, respect. "Miss Miller, when you first stood in my courtroom, I saw only a child playing at being a lawyer. I was wrong. You have demonstrated not only exceptional legal knowledge, but also understanding of what justice truly means." He paused. "This court owes you an apology for its initial dismissal of your capabilities." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison, known for his harsh judgments and never apologies, had just publicly admitted his mistake. "This case is closed," he concluded, bringing down his gavel one final time. The gallery erupted in applause. Reporters rushed forward, photographers' flashes illuminating the scene. In the midst of the chaos, Nancy looked up at Mr. Ruiz, whose weathered face shone with joy and pride. "We did it," she whispered. "No, pequeña abogada," he corrected gently. "You did it." As they made their way through the crowd, Nancy spotted her father standing by the door. Their eyes met briefly. This time, instead of turning away, Nancy gave him a small nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement, the first tiny step on what might be a very long road. Outside, the spring sunshine bathed the courthouse steps in golden light. Reporters clustered around Nancy, shouting questions. "What will you do next?" Nancy looked at Mr. Ruiz, then at her grandmother, then back at the imposing courthouse behind them. "Help people who need it," she said simply. "That's what lawyers are supposed to do, isn't it?" 6 months later, Nancy sat at a small desk, in the corner of a modest office. A newly painted sign on the door read, "Miller and Ruiz Community Legal Services." Mr. Ruiz had converted part of his inherited house into a space where Nancy could offer free legal advice to those who couldn't afford it. Judge Harrison had become an unexpected ally, referring cases and sometimes stopping by with legal books for Nancy's growing library. Her story had inspired a scholarship fund for gifted students from underprivileged backgrounds, and she spoke regularly at schools about finding your voice, no matter your age. Even Frank Miller had started taking hesitant steps back into her life, beginning with weekly letters that Nancy eventually began to answer. As Nancy reviewed a case file, a tenant facing unfair eviction, Mr. Ruiz placed a cup of hot chocolate on her desk. "Not too much work today, pequeña abogada. Remember, you're still a child." Nancy smiled up at him. "Sometimes it takes a child to see things clearly, Mr. Ruiz." He nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your mother would be very proud." Nancy touched the framed photo on her desk, her mother smiling, forever frozen in a moment of joy. "I think she knows. Outside the window, Chicago continued its bustling pace. Inside, a small girl with an extraordinary mind prepared to take on another battle for justice, proving that courage and compassion have no minimum age requirement. Justice, she had told a reporter recently, isn't something you wait to grow into. It's something you carry in your heart, no matter how small that heart might seem. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments, so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel,